Good evening, and welcome to the Carnegie Institution. Would you all think a minute about the whole process by which you arrived in your seat this evening? You read about the lecture, perhaps in our brochure, or perhaps in the Washington Post, or some friend told you about it, and you decided to come. You may have written a date on your calendar, or you may have simply relied on your memory. You decided what time to leave for 16th and P Streets, and whether you would risk the parking situation, or whether you would take the metro, or walk. You found the building. You decided to climb the stairs rather than waste energy by using the elevator. You entered the auditorium, and you noticed the photos taken by Carnegie's Mount Wilson Observatory that are in the light fixture overhead. And you probably could distinguish from various clues which was the sun and which was the moon. You were perhaps surprised to find me here, rather than Richard Meserve, Carnegie's president. He's away this week, and he regrets very much not being here. Perhaps some of you recognize me as Dr. Meserve's predecessor, Maxine Singer. How did you manage to do all of this? It required a great range of thoughts and decisions, followed by actions. You used data that was presented to you or stored already in your mind. And it's fair to say that neither you nor anyone else understands how our brains actually carry out such cognitive processes, what some call consciousness. We even have trouble describing what we mean by cognition or consciousness. After figuring out with James Watson the structure of DNA, Francis Crick turned his inventive mind to the problem of consciousness. And after he died in 2004, his friend and colleague, V.S. Ramachandran, recalled something Crick had said when he was asked to define consciousness. It's no doubt good to have a rough idea of what one is talking about, but matters of terminology are best left to philosophers who spend most of their time on such things. Indeed, clear definitions often emerge from empirical research. Well, empirical research has taught science a lot about the nature of the problem. Stored in the brain's cerebral cortex are intricate networks of cells that we call neurons. These neurons were tailored by evolution to process information in specialized ways. And altogether, there are probably more than 100 billion of them. Regions of our brains work cooperatively, which enable us to process language, make decisions, take the elevator, pass judgment, and express emotion. Neuroscientists, like tonight's speaker, Michael Gazzaniga, have begun to decipher how all this works. They use imaging tools that observe the brain in action, and they study how groups of neurons function. Another tool used by neuroscientists is the study of the brains of people who suffer from particular anatomical lesions in the brain, lesions caused by accidents or by surgical interventions. And with these and other methods, researchers have identified neural networks that are active in specific mental states. Wow, I lost my place, definitely, somewhere. And they're learning how brain processes shape decision-making and how instinct and the unconscious influence our daily behaviors. Michael Gazzaniga is currently the director of the Sage Center for the Study of the Mind and professor of psychology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's a pioneer of cognitive neuroscience, a field that explores the biological foundations of cognition and their behavioral manifestations. He earned his PhD in psychobiology in 1964 at Caltech. As a graduate student, he performed controlled experiments on the behavior of patients who were so severely epileptic that physicians had severed their corpus callosum, that is, the bundle of nerves that connects the brain's two hemispheres. In effect, this operation split the brain into two separate entities. The results of Dr. Gazzaniga's experiments showed distinctive differences in the functioning of the brain's two hemispheres. And in the years that followed, he made important advances in understanding how the hemispheres communicate with each other. He's also had a very strong influence on the training of young scientists and mentoring particularly young neuroscientists at several universities before he moved to Santa Barbara 2 years ago. Professor Gazzaniga is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Neurological Association, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has participated in public television specials about the brain. Perhaps some of you have seen him. And he's published several books for lay people and professionals alike. In 2003, he received the George A. Miller Award of the Cognitive Neuroscience Society, a society which he had earlier founded. He's past president of the American Psychological Society and editor emeritus of the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience. And since 2002, he has been a voice for science as a member of the President's Council on Bioethics. Dr. Gazzaniga is convinced that the results of neuroscience can and should influence many ethical issues that we face today. It's the job of neuroethics, he writes in a recent book, The Ethical Brain, to use what we know about how the brain works to help us better define what it means to be human. In short, he believes we must strive for a brain-based philosophy of life. He's going to speak to us tonight about brains, minds, and social processes. Please join me in welcoming Michael Gazzaniga.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dear, 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 it's daunting when the introduction is probably better than the lecture. But here we go. Purpose of this slide is to remind you that there is life outside of the Beltway, and it's hard duty, but some of us have to do it. And the second reason to have this slide is to indicate that neuroscience is infiltrating all kinds of areas in our social life and more. And I'm here tonight to tell you about a new project and a new effort where we're going to look at the questions of how neuroscience and the law interact. It is a large new project that was just launched 2 days ago, and yet has been sort of bubbling and ongoing for a few months before. And it will try to tackle a variety of questions, some of which I will try to review for you tonight. It's a project, just to let people know, that is sponsored by the MacArthur Foundation and their generosity, and the honorary chair of the national effort is Sandra Day O'Connor. And then, just to get this out of the way, it's all these wonderful people who are part of it. There are 3 networks involved, and each network is co-directed by a neuroscientist and a law professor. So, what is it all about? Well, what it's all about is what goes on here in a courtroom. There's all kinds of things going on here that are amenable to scientific research, and in particular neuroscience research. Is the person lying? Is the evidence and memory of the person testifying accurate? Is there bias in the courtroom? Is there exculpability because maybe the defendant has brain disease and the like? And so over the past year and a half, we've been trying to frame these questions. And in doing it, one comes to learn about the law more than I certainly ever knew. And one comes to appreciate the judicial community and the judges. And I've come to know several of them, and you almost wonder why they do it, because they are true public servants in the sense that they're not there for the money, and it's hard work. And a friend of mine told me why they do it, because they're the only people on earth that can say it is so ordered. So they have a little fun too. The issues that we want to approach tonight have a large context, of course, in the history of law and neuroscience, but particularly in the history of law. And it's the classic principles that have always been debated. Is there a set of universal moral principles sort of built into us? This is being examined now with some positive answers from modern-day neuroscience. Or are our laws really a collection of man-made rules that serve pragmatic ends to allow people to live together? And more importantly, with the expanding knowledge that is occurring in the field of neuroscience, are we subtly changing our sense of what we mean by human nature and what we think of about who we are? And does modern neuroscience really deepen our understanding of human nature? And of course, I think it does. And so I want to take this general landscape and look at these issues. We want to look at the idea of responsibility and how neuroscience may comment on that. We want to look at some straightforward evidence questions and how neuroscience will comment on that. And we also want to look about the new exciting work in social neuroscience and how it may be commenting deeply on how we think about issues such as justice, retribution, and even forgiveness. So let's take a step back and look at where we're come from and where we are on this business of being human. It sort of the major ideas that you and I live under in the West came from people like Copernicus, who pointed out that maybe we're not the center of the universe, and Galileo, who nailed it down with his various measurements, and then along came René Descartes, who established the notion that maybe the biology of ourselves has mechanical and physical rules, and then of course Charles Darwin, with his theory of natural selection, gave us the whole evolutionary perspective of who we are and how we got to be here. And then Freud, with his notion of the unconscious and questions of what are the forces that really govern our behavior, all these chipping away at kind of the centrality of what it means to be human in some sense. And then along comes modern neuroscience with its incredible advances in terms of our mechanistic understanding of the human mind and human brain. And all of this leads to kind of, in some people's mind, not mine, but in some people's mind, to a feeling that, as someone said, to man thinks they're great, but to a mosquito they're only something to eat. And I think we should qualify that. But first of all, to get there, we have to look at the basic question: what is this brain for that everybody in this room has? And it's amazing how, if you ask that question to a neuroscientific audience, not that many people know the answer. They say, well, it's a living, I study it, we study this, study that part of it. But if you really think from an evolutionary biological point of view, what is it for? And what it is for is to make decisions. It makes decisions, a gazillion decisions a day that were completely outside of our conscious awareness, and then it makes many that are within our conscious information, or our conscious moment. And so with the notion that as a decision-making device, you can begin to see this notion that we are a physically driven, causally entity. And you can think of it by one simple experiment. If you take your hand and touch the tip of your nose, you will have the sensation that your fingertip and your nose were touched at the same time. And yet we know that the neuron picking up the sensation of touch from your nose is about 2 inches long, and the one from your hand is about 3.5, 4 feet long in me. And somehow it comes into your brain and it goes into some process where giving rise to the perception that, in fact, you were touched at the same time. And how does all that work? Actually, no one has the slightest idea, but we do know that it goes on before you're consciously aware of it. And in some sense, it has to. By the time you know something, your brain must have already done it. And so this first kind of thinking and observation was made famous 25 years ago by Benjamin Libet at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and at San Francisco. And, sorry, they trained me to do that. So my apologies to Libet. Who basically made the observation that, through a variety of observations, but just to capture it quickly, that you can demonstrate that 350 milliseconds before an act, you are aware of a consciously act, the brain's already doing its work to make that act consciously available to you. And by that sort of feel to the fact that this brain is determined and this brain is doing the heavy lifting for our consciousness, we're adding things like the following news report, that the brain can now read people's intentions. Brain scanning technologies can now read people's intentions, so that by doing the proper experiment, you can determine whether the person in the scanner is going to choose A or B way before there's any behavior out of the person. And these are done in electrophysiological experiments in animal models, and a long series of that kind of work goes on now. So the whole notion is, by the time you know something, the brain's already done it. And that then just makes very clear this causal chain claim. And let's just say it so that we know what we're talking about here. The brain determines the mind, and the brain is a physical entity. The physical world is determined, so our brains must also be determined. If our brains are determined, and if the brain is the necessary and sufficient organ that enables the mind, then we are left with the belief that our thoughts that arise from our mind are also determined. Thus, free will is an illusion, and we must revise our concept of what it means to be personally responsible for our actions. The legal system must change its assumptions. That's the strong version of the case. What do we think about it? Well, we have no problem saying there's all kinds of automatic processes in our body, gene expression, there's a protein production, to the building of our body, to the physiological maintenance of our body. All that goes on automatically, and no one's problem by that. But when someone suggests the brain is automatic, and it's doing its things also in that sort of fashion, nobody likes that thought, and understandably. And furthermore, nobody believes it. No one in this room really actually thinks that they're here because their brain made them do it, and they really have no control over this, and the whole thing is blah, blah, blah. And yet, we do believe it in another way if you're scientifically trained and committed. So what's the deal? What's going on there? Well, this gives me a quick opportunity to tell you what I think is why we feel free, why we have this illusion that we're in charge. And it relates to some research that I've done on these patients that Dr. Singer reviewed. And they're patients who've had their corpus callosum sectioned, the connection between their two hemispheres sectioned to control their epilepsy. And what happens postoperatively is they can speak out of one hemisphere, They cannot speak out of the left. So they can talk out of their left hemisphere, but not out of their right, because the communication between the two hemispheres has been severed, and only information presented to the left hemisphere can be spoken about, and information presented to the right cannot. So we studied these patients for years and years, and we finally got around to asking them, you know, how do they deal with this? What do they think about this? And so we ran a very, very simple test. We showed the patients two pictures. If a patient fixates a point, how your visual system is hooked up is everything to the right of the fixation goes to your left brain, and everything to the left of the fixated point goes to your right brain. Everybody in the room, that's how you're hooked up. So if you fixate that point, that's where that information is at this moment. But you see, you're hooked up, so you see both pictures. In the split brain case, however, only the left brain sees this, only the right brain sees that. So how do you know that? Well, what you do is you put out choices for them to make after the stimulus is flashed. So here's the picture of the chicken claw, and here are 4 possibilities, the chicken, of course, being the most related to the chicken claw. And to the other hemisphere, you put out a picture of a shovel that goes with the snow scene, and the left hand could choose that. And in fact, that's exactly what happens. You present that to the patients. The patients would say, if you just ask them verbally, what do you see? They would just say the chicken claw, because the information on the snow scene goes to the right hemisphere, so it's connected from the left, and so forth. So now, if you do this manual response, what you do is you see the patients respond as you see. The right hand, which gets its control from the left hemisphere, points to the chicken, and the left hand, which gets its control from the right hemisphere, points to the shovel, which goes for the snow scene. Well, for some reason, it took us 25 years to figure out, to ask the patient, you know, the patient's doing this, right? Saying, well, why are you doing that? He says, oh, well, why are you responding in this way? And immediately the patient says, oh, that's easy. He says the chicken goes with the chicken claw, and then looking down at his left hand, he says, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed. So after dozens and hundreds of experiments now, where on a variety of patients, we came to realize that there's something special in the left hemisphere of the human called the interpreter. It is trying to interpret the behaviors that are actually produced by us, the feelings, the emotions, and all the rest. And here is an example, another example of the case JW in an actual experiment looking at this.
Joe says 2 words simultaneously. Bell goes to his non-speaking right brain. Music to his speaking left brain. When asked to point to a picture of what he saw, he chooses Bell. But when asked why...
Yeah, why'd you pick that one?
Music.
Music?
And when asked to explain...
It was music and Bell, and it was a few minutes ago, last time I heard any music was coming from the bells out here, banging away.
So the bell's outside here?
So, they couldn't have answered me.
What's extraordinary is that Joe's speaking left brain concocts a plausible story of why he pointed to Bell, even when some of the other pictures more obviously represent music. Gazzaniga believes this...
So we feel free. Who else is moving our hand and talking? It's us. Because it's the most natural interpretation of the world that you can imagine. And we can feel free even though we can believe that our brains are automatic. And in some sense, we want them to be automatic. We want them to do the things that are decided upon by our decisional network. Now, how does that view differ from the current legal view of how the mind works? Well, it's really not inconsistent, in the sense that the legal view of the mind is real simple. We're all practical reasoners, and we're all working freely, our brains working freely and normally, and we're collecting together information to affect in actual behavior. It's a simple enough view of the mind, and that's the legal view of the mind. And so personal responsibility, as believed by the legal community, is a product of a normally functioning brain. So when something happens to the brain, there's a lesion to the brain, there's some neurotransmitter disorder going on in the brain, that abnormality makes for exculpability, that the person may not be responsible because they're not calling upon the normal processes of the brain. And so we're seeing cases where evidence is presented in the courts to argue for the fact that because Jones has a frontal lobe lesion or because Jones may suffer from a mental disease, their brain isn't normally functioning, and therefore they're exculpable. So this sort of argument has been used in various cases, notably in the Hinckley case after several tries where the judge threw out the CT scan information is finally considered as part of the punishment, and Hinckley was considered not guilty by reason of insanity. And yet you have to push on this. You have to push on this very hard. So the classic case is Phineas Gage, where a left frontal lobe lesion was created by this spike going through his head, and such patients become disinhibited. There's some indication that some of them may become a little bit more violent, and so forth. And yet the real fact is that the vast majority of patients who have such a lesion are not violent and do not commit crimes. So on the one hand, you have something that is biasing, maybe, someone towards an act that they would normally engage in. But on the other hand, we know that that same lesion does not always do that. So this is an open question, and this is one of the questions this project is going to have to come to grips with. Is the neuroscientific knowledge that suggests one is being biased towards an act sufficient to make them fully exculpable for a particular act? The same goes with schizophrenia as an example. There's a neurotransmitter disorder. Should one be exculpable of a crime because one is schizophrenic? Well, it's a hard argument because, in fact, schizophrenics on drugs have no greater increase in violent behavior than from the normal population. And even off drugs, it's only elevated a little bit. It's not like there's an electric switch in the brain that if you have one of these disorders, you become a violent person. So schizophrenics, people with frontal lobe lesions, they all follow rules. They all, as I like to put it, they all stop at red lights. So rule-based behavior is normal and active. So what do we do with this problem? Well, the way to start to think about it, I think, but this is one of the things that's going to be looked at. So I'm giving you a point of view here. I'm not giving you the answer. I wish I knew it. The brain really has no area or network for responsibility. And how we have to think about this is that the idea of personal responsibility arises out of a group. It arises out of when more than one person comes together. If you're the only person on the world, there'd be no concept of personal responsibility. Personally responsible to whom? And so you quickly see that this notion of personal responsibility is a rule generated out of a social group, and as such, it is to be found in the rules of the social group. So an analogy is that cars are automatic, but you wouldn't understand traffic by understanding thoroughly a car. And brains are automatic, and you wouldn't understand responsibility by understanding the brain. It's in the social group. That's one issue that will be tackled. So this is an area where maybe neuroscience knowledge is not appropriate for assessing culpability. That's what we're going to look at, and people will argue, believe me, heavily on both sides of the issue. Now, what about other kinds of evidence where neuroscience and the law are beginning to interact? Well, if we even want to find that magic pixel that is responsible for somebody doing something, and that is the goal of a lot of research in this area, we have to go into that. That's a fine goal. We have to go into that enterprise knowing some things so that we're not caught short. Now, one of the things that has to be appreciated is the individual variation that exists in our brains, in our the functional use of our cortical circuitry. And let me show you an example of this. Here's an example of a simple little memory experiment. And where people are looking at which part of the brain is active during the recall of information that they had learned earlier. And what is typically seen when you see one of these reports is an average picture like that, where they take 16 subjects that were in the experiments. They have a way of morphing their brain into a common data set, and they can look for areas that are more active than not, and they draw a conclusion about the areas, about what the brain mechanisms are that are responsible for a particular kind of cognitive act. Well, if you look at all 16 subjects, you can see that the activation patterns all over the place. And now you ask yourself the question, well, that's biology, so that's variation, and that's why you average, you get da. Well, the problem is that you bring these 16 subjects back, as you see in this case, and there they are in their pattern, subject SC's pattern on day 1, and 6 months later, you can see that it's highly correlated. So the fact is that Jones figures out one way to solve this task a little bit differently than Smith. Or they figure it out the same way, but different brain areas involved. And dissecting that out is a very active part of this individual variation work. What we need to know is that it's going to be a hard argument for someone to show a particular brain pattern in a particular person and say, well, that's the deal. That's why they did X, Y, or Z, when obviously there's all this variation to consider. And these are activation patterns that reflect large areas of the brain that are involved in particular activities. There's new ways to study the human brain in action, and it capitalizes on the fact that or makes note of the fact that our brains are hugely interconnected with white matter. These are the neurons that connect a cortical area from one point to another point. In the rat, it has a minuscule amount of white matter. In the human, as you can see, this is a cross-section of the same area. Human, as you can see, it looks like we're almost all fibers and no thought. So can you study this long track anatomy? Up until recently, not really, because of the nature of human dissection and the length of these pathways. But through new imaging technologies called diffusion tensor imaging, that many of you know about, of course, we can now track internally the very pathways that make up the connections between the hemispheres, the connections within a hemisphere. And what we're finding is that if you very carefully study the connection, say, from area 7 on one part of the left hemisphere to the connections on the other, what one finds is that there is, you can track these fibers where they go across through the corpus callosum. You can track, like this is area 7's connections, and then you can see, these are the average of about 9 subjects, but you can see in the individual scans of these that this blue is all over the place and proportionately different. So Jones may have more blue than Smith and so forth. You get the idea. And if you look at the individual variation of just one connection, this is from area 19 to 19, and you look carefully at this, these are 8 different subjects, and where these fibers cross and the density of them varies. So there's not only going to be individual variation in the activation areas, there's going to be individual areas in the networks. And as we learn more and more and more, the implication for this in one sense are profound about individual variation and individuality. On another, you can see in the setting of the law how complex it will be. I'll skip that. It's another example. Well, what about where neuroscience speaks to other critical social issues of the day? Now, many of us thought that the brain dead issue was dead, but it was recently resuscitated by a very interesting meeting at the Vatican and reported out, and I'll tell you a minute about that. And then actually in this current New Yorker, there's another article. This one deals with brain death, and this deals with minimally conscious states and persistent vegetative states. This is an a fascinating topic. It's in the courts. It's been in the courts, as you know. And neuroscience, it's neuroscience's job to kind of figure this out and see what we think about this for these important social decisions. The brain dead one is actually kind of easy to my mind. And this is the summary written by the brilliant and the world's best neurologist, in my opinion, Dr. Jerry Posner. And he just makes a very succinct summary on this issue, which is important to consider. He points out all death is brain death. That's what you mean by death. If the brain dies but other organs are preserved, that individual is dead. Jerry thinks very clearly. Death is a process. The process begins with the integrative function of the entire brain and the brainstem fail. The process ends when every cell in the entire body is dead. Death is pronounced during the process when irreversibility is established, but not all cells are yet dead. So, if you didn't know that, when you're dead, for a few days your fingernails keep growing and your hair and all that stuff. When all neurologically appropriate uses the clinical criteria to establish brain death, the diagnosis of death is certain. There have been no documented exceptions to that. When a qualified neurologist applying the criteria for brain death has declared brain death. Technology can preserve the organs of the dead person, nevertheless that individual is dead, and if heart-beating death, which is a concern to some, defies our common sense perception and is counterintuitive, so is the fact the earth is not flat. So get over it, is what he's suggesting. So that's, these are debatable, arguable. You have to understand that. I'm just trying to give a position, and there's obviously others represented. But that is more certain. That's where neuroscience is sort of on sure legs. It is not on sure legs in things like persistent vegetative states and mentally conscious states. And that is important, that when you hear of these miraculous recoveries and miraculous stories, that is what they're talking about. And it is just the case that neuroscience isn't yet ready to be able to predict with certainty, with complete certainty, who will awake and who will not. So what is this persistent vegetative state? Well, one thing, and of course it's made famous in the Terry Schiavo case, one of the things that it is important to realize is that a persistent vegetative state is a clinical diagnosis. It is what you finally say, well, that's what this person has by elimination of all kinds of things. And when it lasts for more than a month, it's called persistent vegetative state. If it's just a month, it's vegetative, and all these little details. And there's a big problem, as you can see, with all kinds of people in the United States suffering from this and are caring for them. So while neurologists are certain about brain death, they're not at all certain about PVS at this point in our knowledge. And the question is, will we become knowledgeable with certainty about that state? I think with time, we may well develop a certainty about it, but it clearly is not at hand right now. And so the easy and hard cases for neuroscience. Somebody can come in and ask a neuroscience, does the embryo have a brain, a 14-day embryo? The answer is no, it doesn't have a brain, it hasn't even started to form and so forth. We know that. That's just textbook neuroscience. Here is Terry Schiavo's MR. Can she, or CT I think it is, is she alive in there at some point? Well, it's just you can make the prediction, given the length on the machine, that there's never going to be recovery and all that good clinical work, but you can't look at the scan and make the prediction from the scan. That's where we are in knowledge. So then it becomes interesting to consider, and this builds on a lot of cognitive neuroscience research. Why is it so hard to let go when people are like this? And it's simple. If you look at the MIT experiment on COG, the robot that keeps being added to and keeps being more lifelike, you find an interesting phenomenon. If you're a new visitor to this lab and you see the robot, you're first stunned by the fact that when you walk in the room, it follows you, with its head and with its eyes. When you sit down, it looks down at you. When you stand up, it looks up at you. And they just keep adding to this. And it actually wasn't very much of the robot before you gave it agency. You say, geez, thing's alive, you know, and so forth and so on. So we build in our mind a model of the other person. We have a theory about the other person. That's called theory of mind, and we as humans just do this reflexively. And we do it to funny things like robots. We do it to our car. We do it to our old shoe, you know. I'm never getting rid of that sweater, because that's, you know, that kind of stuff. We build models, and when they become really human-like, we give them a sense of agency. Well, how can you expect anything? So we have a theory of the robot acts like something, and the triggers our theory of them, and we animate it and give it agency. How can that not be going on to a mother whose child they love dearly and sitting there and eyes open and all years of experience? Of course, any little glimpse is going to trigger the model in the mother's mind of the agency. So these things are understandable, but it remains the duty of science to try to figure out if we can help really sort this out. Okay, the problem of bias in the courtroom. Another problem that will be and can be addressed through modern research. I love this quote from Chief Justice Kennedy. The law makes it a promise of neutrality. If the promise gets broken, the law as we know it ceases to exist. So is there bias? Is there bias in prosecutions? Is there bias in the courtroom? And it's a continual problem, as you know. We just saw it in the Duke lacrosse case, and maybe that was a function of a well-studied phenomenon of eyewitness bias and this phenomenon in the cognitive literature called the own race memory bias. And this simply says that a Caucasian is quite easily able to distinguish between other Caucasians, but not maybe the black community. The black community can distinguish between the black community, but not the white community. The Japanese can distinguish, and so forth and so on. And so there's this tremendous literature over 50 years that there is this own race bias. The capacity to discriminate is there, better within your practice social group than the other group. And recently in studies where we've carried out these studies in split brain experiments, we find in fact that the part of the brain that's responsible for face perception really trips up and is much better within race than between races. So here is a bias. Should this be taken in with the new neuroscience, the new neurophysiology, the new neuroimaging, and considered at a deeper level? And it probably will be. Another example is the dehumanizing the people. So there's a tendency, one can now study in the brain imaging environment people's emotional reactions to situations where they're trying to evoke pride, envy, and pity. And one can see that these different emotional states have different neural signatures. And then you can, so the pride, envy, and pity are depicted by certain facial expressions in certain settings of people, and people have this response. But if you then put up someone who is like a drug addict or some other group that is not part of the norm of the judgmental system, there's no brain response. It's like they're treated as if it was a block or an inanimate object. And so by not having that emotional sense of empathy or pity or pride or what have you to this person, if they're dismissed, there's some peripheral system in you that biases you away from considering that person emotionally. That's a huge problem. So that's got to be looked at. Okay, so we're now looking at, am I all right for time? Yeah. We're now looking at this exciting field, and I will wind up with this sort of thing to get you to see other issues that can be addressed in the Neuroscience and Law project. This is a poignant picture that is during the Second World War, or Korean War I think it is actually, where there was a horrible battle here. And as my colleague Lita Gazzaniga says, we know lots about this guy over here, the psychology, the cognition, tabulating, keeping track of what happened. But we really know very little about social interaction, and we're just beginning to learn about it, because very clever people now are studying moral judgment making, social decisions in the magnet, and trying to determine how much of our stance, moral stance, is built into us, how much of it obviously is rule-based, and the like, and making the distinctions between the two. I personally became very interested in this when I realized, as someone who's been there at the beginning from cognitive neuroscience, where people take stimuli and they drive them down to little squares and triangles, I woke up one morning and I said, well, Mike, when's the last time you thought about a triangle? I mean, come on, get real. And you realize that 99% of your thoughts are social in nature. And maybe that's what the brain's for. Maybe it's all about thinking about the other person and your social, you're comparing all the time and so forth. So that now can be studied. And in a classic experiment, already classic, done about 3 years ago now, by Jonathan Cohen and Josh Green, when they both were still at Princeton, they began to look at questions of moral judgments and how much of them are built in and not. And it kind of comes down to the question that there's 6 billion people in the world. 6 billion people, give or take a few hundred million. And pretty much we get along. We really get along. And if you, by the way, just take 1% of them, they're bad apples. That's a lot of people. But our species gets along. How does it navigate through the social world? Are there built-in moral judgmental systems that all of us share? So Mark Hauser did this one experiment to test this. He tested the peoples of the world through his website at Harvard. He's a professor at Harvard, if you don't know him. And he tested the peoples of the world, and he said, look, how are they going to respond to moral judgmental questions? All religions, all ages, both sexes, and have you. What does our species, how do they respond to dilemmas, moral dilemmas? So the first one is, this is called the trolley problem. Many of you are highly familiar with it, but for those who are not, Denise is a passenger on a train whose driver has fainted. On the main track ahead are 5 people. The main track is a side track leading off to the right, and Denise can turn the train onto it. There's one person on the right-hand track. Denise can turn the train, killing the one, or she can refrain from turning the train and letting the 5 die. Is it okay for Denise to turn the train? 89% of the people in the world say, you bet. Absolutely. Doesn't matter what their religion, doesn't matter what their beliefs, doesn't matter their culture, doesn't matter anything. It's 89%, 98% say that's okay. That's incredible. Now what about if Frank is on a footbridge over the train tracks? He sees a train approaching the bridge out of control. There are 5 people on the track. Frank knows the only way to stop the train is to push the fat guy over. But the only available, well, especially as this large man also watching the train, Frank can shove the man onto the track in the path of the train, killing him, or he can refrain. Is it okay to push Frank over? And only 11% of the people of the world say that. So this is the phenomenon. This is the basic, and Cohen and Green put this experiment in a scanner. And what's the difference? Well, the difference is that when the condition of Frank is presented, the emotional system of the brain lights up. The brakes come on, say no, don't do it. It comes on in everybody. So here is a circuit, a system, a thing that our species just won't do. And why? Well, the first steps on this are that there seems to be an emotional system that is active in one case and not another. Now, I think that we're going to find all kinds of moral judgment paradigms active, and we're going to find more and more about this. And then we discover the second point, that while we may all behave more or less exactly the same on a variety of moral judgments, we all will come up with a different reason why we do it, because of this interpreter thing. And this goes back to an experiment I ran years ago in one of the first split brain cases, And I'll just explain this as we go along. It's not with sound. This is case NG. And this is way back in Caltech, and we showed her pictures to her left field, right hemisphere. I asked her, what did you see? She says, nothing, terribly bored by the whole experiment. Then we go back and we give her a surprise stimulus of a pinup girl. What did you see? She's laughing, you know. So I say, so why are you laughing? And she says, oh, you've got a funny machine there. And she cooks up some story as to why she's laughing. The right hemisphere produces the affective state. Left hemisphere doesn't know about it cognitively, but the left hemisphere notices everybody's laughing here, and it's got to come up with a theory. Someone in the moral condition stops, doesn't do something. People ask, why'd you do that? Or they relate it to some pet theory they have about the nature of the world. So this is going to be a powerful area of research in the future, and it's going to invade such questions as the following. And this is with respect to the law question. Our prisons now, 20% of the population of a prison are psychopaths, and the huge percent is antisocial personality disorder. Now, if we're learning more and more about psychopaths and maybe their brain state, and maybe they have an abnormal brain state, are we going to consider that fair game for exculpability? I think that's a question that's out there that will be hashed out in the years to come. But look at this. If you actually look at what we know about psychopathy and its place in the law and what happens, there's this very disheartening thing that while there's a lower rate of recidivism amongst low psychopaths, in high psychopathic people, it suggests that if we let them out or don't put them away, as you want to put it that crude way, they'll be back. So if we do take a more lenient policy on this, will crime increase in society? Society willing to pay that cost because they just don't like the idea of prison? These are all tough questions, and they're nowhere near being answered in a satisfactory way now. But you can just see it bubbling up from the neuroscience that's going on, the practical world of the law, and you see the two beginning to interact. If you do a search on Westlaw, one of the legal sources, there are now 910 cases ongoing in the United States where neuroscience is at issue and brain states and so forth. So it's here. And the question is, what do we think about it? And that's another thing. So finally then, the big questions. We should also, with all this new knowledge, you're going to look at what our very sense of justice is and what we mean by it. And our concepts of retribution, concepts of forgiveness. John Cottingham, a British philosopher, wrote that, you know, retribution really has all these dimensions to it. Repayment theory, just desert theory, penalty theory, minimalist theory, satisfaction, and so forth. We really have to sort all those out. And those will be sorted out in the brain imaging environment as to what we want when we say we want justice. And then as we come to understand that, well, what do we really mean by that? And how do we contrast that with one of the most important lectures I've probably ever given, the Sermon on the Mount? Forgive them. Sure they did, but forgive them. Do we want that? Are we ready for that? Or, as I've learned the new word, and I'm just dying to use it, is that angelism? And you can ask me afterward what that means. So here's where we are, and people are already thinking about it and jumping ahead. And I'll conclude with this quote by Janet Radcliffe Richards, a philosopher from the UK, where she writes very perceptively, but arguably, I don't know if I believe it or not. If we understand that there are good evolutionary reasons for our wanting people to suffer when they have done direct or indirect harm to us, then we can account for our strong feelings about the appropriateness of retribution without presuming they are a guide to moral truth. We may be able to recognize our retributive feelings as deep and important aspects of our character and take them seriously to that extent without endorsing them as a guide to truth and start rethinking our attitudes towards punishment on that basis. Oh boy, there's a lot there. And that's something we as a culture have to think, and it's going to be aided and abetted with all the neuroscience that's going on. So I think that the psychologists and the psychiatrists in the past have had great importance in the courtroom, and they basically come in and say what they think about a case. And I think what's going to happen with greater accuracy and more intensity is neuroscientists are going to come in and tell us what they know is true. And are we ready for that? I hope our little effort will contribute to our being ready for that eventuality. Thank you.
Time for a few questions, not too many. There are microphones in the aisle for anyone who wants to ask a question. There's someone over there. Oh, you can start, please.
I'm just curious. While you were talking, I was thinking about the famous Twinkie defense back in the 70s, and I was wondering, has there been discussion about people making claims that of external factors affecting the internal behavior?
Yeah, it has a long tradition of that kind. There's the Twinkie defense. There's early environmental causes maybe shape someone to be of a particular kind. So the notion of exculpability because of a prior bad experience, whether it's lifestyle or brain, is an old case. And the question is, do we want to give it pure status so that we make this an acceptable exculpable reason? And that's where the debate is right now. Is the brain going to tell us more than those classic issues is going to tell us? Is the brain research going to tell us more? And I don't know yet. Right now, I think I kind of have the view that we should go very cautiously on this point because it's very hard to find someone who can't still follow rules. And as I said, from my perspective, responsibility is a rule. It's not something in your brain. Yes, sir.
I think there's a fundamental difference which you didn't state between Denise and Frank. Mm-hmm. Implicit in Frank's decision is that he himself could serve as the weight.
Yeah.
Yeah. This flashed in my mind immediately when you said it. I have been in the position of having to make a similar decision. I had a person in a freezing water, several people in the boat. Although I was a strong swimmer, I chose not to go into the water because then I would have two people in the water and one less person in the boat to pull us out. Yeah. I've given a lot of thought to this, and it seems to me that Frank could be in a position of, I don't want to do it myself, and therefore I will not force it onto someone else. I'm not sure that was actually the experiment that you described, or gets the result that you described.
Well, you're absolutely right. And as you can imagine, this experiment done jointly by a brain imaging guy and a philosopher has made its way quickly into the philosophical field, and people have pondered these moral questions for years, and they've taken that exact example and criticized it, and many, many more. And so there are literally dozens of new experiments trying to dissect this thing down and be more specific, including most notably the work by Josh Green himself. So I have no argument with this. In this kind of lecture, I'm trying to highlight that these things are now being studied, and there's going to be corrections and modifications of the work for a long time to come.
I've been going this side now. Yeah. And we won't take any more than the people who are already in. Thanks.
The implications, actually, of the earliest part of your lecture are very, very fundamental, really, to culture. And what I'm talking about is your distinction between the brain and the mind and the interaction there. The question I'm going to pose to you, it's a little bit further than the legal system, but the very way in which we image life itself, what we are, who we are. For example, there's a story that goes behind that yellow piece of cloth on your shirt, your tie. The point is, are we telling ourselves the appropriate story now to what life is that is complementary to the reality, be it environmental or whatever. And we may be in a period of history where we have to start to pull back and see what this mind thing is and how it's been created and what images are shaping our behavior.
Yeah. Michael Polanyi wrote a book on that many years ago, and if you talk to people who the people who really consider I know it sounds extreme, but they consider the extraterrestrial life issues. They have concluded that when they find us, that means they are of another type and silicon-based, and will have different mental processes. So people have taken that and said, well, maybe in our own evolution we're kind of halfway there. And as we develop more interactions with computers and to the extent that we can become cyborgs by adding devices that help our memory, or devices that help our prosthesis. You can just see it creeping into us, and we may change. Boom, something happens. It's different. It's so far now from day-to-day life and what we just judge as normal that it's hard to sell, except to college students. And, but I hear you, and I think that's an issue. Yeah.
I'd like to ask, legally, why does culpability matter?
Yeah.
If one can prove that someone commits crimes because they have some biological impulse to do so that is out of their control, why is it not then an ethical responsibility to imprison them, to keep them from doing things in the future, since we know there's no way to convince them not to?
Yeah. Well, there's a maybe it's the same version of the question, but there's just a whole bunch of people that they don't care. In fact, if you find that Jones is the child molester, or that Jones killed Smith, or that whatever Jones did, all you care about as a community is get that guy out of here, right? Get him out of here. And they don't even listen to the sentencing part of the trial. This is a common phenomenon. They don't care, oh yeah, he has this disorder and that disorder, and his mother slapped him when he was young, I don't care. Just get him out of my life. And so that issue is presented, and it's a social judgment. And so far, our society is built in such a way that if you can say, well, there's less diminished responsibility here because of some other X factor, we tend to go with it. But should we stop going with it? That's a social question, a social decision to make.
Last question.
What are the chances that neuroscience might help predict the ability of a system to reform an individual?
Yeah. Well, as you know, I'm sure you know, one of the great failures in all areas of behavior that's not wanted is that the treatments don't seem to do much, and the recidivism rate is huge and so forth. And of course, there are cures and all that, but there's a lot of recidivism. I think we live in this. I love neuroscience and all it's doing and all it's discovering. But it is, one has to, when you're really talking about applying neuroscience to social questions, you have to be very cautious. Do we really know that much? Do we really understand all the variables? Are we capturing a small bit of something and try to expand it up to, so you can explain to someone why you're spending all your time doing this, and the like. So I'm very, very cautious about, and I think the function of one of the social functions of this project is to really get it out on the table, have everybody look at it and say, what do we as a culture and as a scientifically rational group want to say about X, Y, and Z? And I don't know where a lot of these things are going to wind up. I certainly don't know, and that's one of the goals of the project, trying to just be enlightened about them. Sometimes here I gave a perspective, probably my own ideas popped up, but that's just my thought. It's not yet what's emerged from this effort.
Well, Mike, thank you for really